Thank you very much. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here today. And this is my first time in Slovakia, so thank you very much for having me and making me feel so comfortable. This is a really important conference, not only for the region, but I think globally, and I'm looking forward to feeding back at Cambridge what we've learnt today. Anyone know what this is? This is part of ChatGPT. This is a silicon monocrystal. We get asked a lot, what is AI? What does it look like? What does ChatGPT look like? What is it? What can it do? And I think it's really important that we start breaking down AI into the parts that it's made from. Images like this remind us that ChatGPT is environmental. It's something that comes from the earth. There are consequences from extracting the material components. It brings into the fore environmental questions and, as we'll see in a second, labor issues. So I'm a senior research fellow at the University of Cambridge, and I do a lot of different things. I predominantly research high-risk tools, which are labeled under the EU AI Act as things that are the most likely to be potentially damaging. So from recruitment tools to education, AI, to tools that are used by the police. And I'll talk a little bit about those in a minute. I've also got 2 books out at the moment. One is on the history of utopian science fiction written by women, which was my PhD. And the other one is about feminist approaches to AI. And then in March, I've got a book out called The Good Robot, and we interview leading thinkers across the world on what good technology means to them. Anyone know what these are? So these images are supposed to do something similar. Here on the left, we have a representation of large language models of what happens when data is ingested and then guesses what comes next. These models are supposed to help us work out what language is, and so that we can replicate it computationally. And on the right here, we have a representation of the workforce, the labor that goes into the data annotation process. These are real people making subjective decisions about how to annotate the world, how to label it, how to reduce its complexity into data that can then be used by AI systems. So when we think of machines being objective, when we think of them being able to understand the world neutrally, perhaps, this is wishful thinking. It's what we might call techno-determinism, the idea that machines can solve problems that humans cannot. I specialize in recruitment tools that are used to look at somebody during a video interview and decide what their personality is. And a lot of these tools use the big 5-factor analysis. So they decide whether you are conscientious, extroverted, from looking at your face during a video interview. Now, I suspect that no one here, perhaps, has been subjected to some of these tools, because it's mostly the younger generation that are exposed to them now, certainly in the UK and the US. So, can a machine understand your personality from looking at your face? Who thinks so? Unsure, we're unsure. So we tested this out at Cambridge. I got some computer science students to replicate one of these models. And what happened was the blue line is the original line. Ooh. That was taken when you take a snapshot of a person's face, and then the machine will tell you what their personality score is like. So you can see here, they rate relatively highly for extroversion. And then the green line is what happens when you change the contrast, brightness, and saturation of the image. So if you change the actual image itself, it also changes your personality score. So we showed why these systems don't necessarily do what they say on the tin. And certainly I feel this way about my personality. Sometimes I feel extroverted, and sometimes I feel quite shy. So it would be unlikely that a machine could work that out on my behalf. There's not much regulation around these tools. The EU AI Act, when it comes into force, will clamp down on some of the claims that are being made. There's an act in Illinois and in New York that say that you have to say what characteristics these systems are trying to look for. But at the moment, it's a pretty unregulated space. And a lot of these companies are publishing white papers. And white papers are something that are supposed to be based on scientific analysis. They're supposed to be science papers. And they're often written in the language of science, making it very difficult for marketing experts and recruitment experts to be able to say, actually, I don't think these tools work as they claim to do. Now, the idea of culture fit has somewhat been debunked in recruitment because it's not about looking for someone who fits your organization so much as transforming your organization to make it meaningfully inclusive of a diverse range of candidates. And yet, these tools still use these ideas. And this is a classic in AI. When we move forward with technology, we move back to the 18th century in terms of our ideas about how the world works. Why do we have these tools? Why are we trying to observe the world neutrally? Well, recruitment is one of these very, very difficult areas that hasn't been modernized in a long time. And like many other facial recognition technologies, there is a desire to observe the world and to be able to assess everybody neutrally. But the question remains, can we be reduced to neutral data points? Can we have our personalities stand in for our race and our gender and our class, things that they're trying to strip from a candidate's profile so that they don't discriminate during hiring? No, at the front. This is a really tempting idea, right? That, we are underneath it all just humans, and everything else is layered on top of us. But of course, our experience, our healthcare outcomes, our education are all part of what makes us us. And the trick then is not to try and get rid of parts of people, but to love them, to look at them generously during the hiring process, and to transform the organization so that they fit as well. On the left, we have Catherine Blackford, who was an early phrenologist. So she believed very much that you could look at somebody's face and decide what their character was. So this was very common in the 19th century. And what we're trying to say is not that tools necessarily replicate this, but they are very much indebted to these histories. I don't know what you think of her profile. She obviously thought that it was really great and it was expressive of her wonderful personality. I'm not so sure. So if you're interested in this kind of study, it was published in the BBC, and we have a paper on it. And I think we didn't realize it would have so much uptake, but it did just show that this idea of tools trying to observe the world neutrally wasn't working. Now, in the UK, we like to think that we're very democratic, that we're doing everything very well. We often say, all the bad stuff happens in the US, but in the UK, we're fine. Sadly, this is absolutely not the case, and I don't know whether you've been following, but the UK government has just signed an enormous contract with Palantir, who are responsible for a lot of the family separations in the US for migrant hunting. So we're pretty upset about that. What's almost worse is that in the US, the police were using a technology called Geophidia and another one called Data Miner to track and monitor Black Lives Matter protests. And what they were doing was pairing with these companies who were using a range of different AI technologies packaged under what they were calling protest recognition technology, in order to be able to say, okay, there's a crowd of people in Baltimore, and we think that they are going to turn into a violent protest. Now, how do you decide what a violent protest is going to look like before it happens? How do you measure violence in a protest? Capitol Hill, pretty violent. More violent than BLM? There were not many police at Capitol Hill. That was one of the things that came out of the reporting. But there were an absolute ton of police in Baltimore after the death of Freddie Gray. And that was because the US police were using this technology that was identifying crowds of black and brown people as a potentially violent protest. And one of the things I was looking at with this technology was saying, okay, is this bias or is this something else? Because whether a technology is good or not depends very much on the client. It depends on how data is being operationalized and acted on. All technology is political. All organizations have their own politics, their own ethics. And so whether a technology is good depends not on the technology itself, but on that relationship between the organization, the deployer, the user, and institutions. So there was lots of different elements of this technology, but one of the ones that I found most interesting is that it was using machine vision to analyze placards like this, Justice for Freddie Gray, and pair them alongside the people here. So here we have African Americans with dreadlocks, and these were all going into the system and being connected with how the system was analyzing dangerous protests. So yes, this is in the UK, we've now spent £5 million on exactly this technology, which was very much part of Priti Patel and our government's anti-protest stance. So now in the UK, I don't know whether you know, but we're not allowed to go over a certain decibel level when we protest. They can't be too noisy, and it's called the Noisy Bill. And it was mostly designed to clamp down on left-wing protests, so Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion, where people have drums. So it's a particular kind of protest that is being erased. Another example of technology not doing what it says on the tin is Compass. So in the US, various states had implemented a technology that was designed to help people in the judicial system decide if someone was going to re-offend. Now, how do you know if someone's going to commit another crime? It's difficult. What we found was that these technologies were twice as likely to predict that young black males were going to re-offend as they did. And there was a study that lasted 10 years, and it tracked different populations and their likelihood of re-offense. And we know that these technologies are twice as likely to keep someone in jail than they should be predicting. How do you combat this? How do you de-bias these kinds of technologies? Well, it's really tricky because there's a short-term and a long-term answer. Say, for example, there's surveillance which clamps down on black women and are more likely to be able to misidentify black women. We can see here on the left is a project called Gender Shades. And what it was trying to do was make computer vision and facial recognition better at identifying black female faces. Because in the UK, we have when you upload your passport onto the internet, you can renew your passport online. And it was saying that black female faces had their mouths open, and therefore it wasn't verifying these photos. And so there was a lot of projects around this to try and make facial recognition better at identifying the faces of black women. But is that actually resolving the situation when black women are way more likely to be at the butt end of surveillance? So facial recognition is more likely to be used against black women for surveillance, certainly across the States and in the UK. So the question is, do we lean in and make sure that different kinds of people are better represented in data sets? Or Do we lean out and say, no, I don't want to be part of this system at all. I don't want my data involved in this system to be used against me down the line. So these are the different kinds of questions that we're trying to grapple with. At Cambridge at the moment, I'm working on building the world's first tool that will help companies meet the EU's obligations. And this involves collaborating with an Italian AI service provider called Amagamma. And it's going to be a one-stop shop for companies that want to self-audit, but also that need to submit documents eventually down the line when the EU AI Act comes into effect. We're seeing at the moment what I kind of call regulation nationalism, which is that the EU's AI Act will dominate for a while because it's the first, it's come in really quickly. It involves any AI company that is deploying tools in the EU. The US will have their own. The UK has done a pretty poor job. I don't know whether you followed the AI summit with that very embarrassing interview with Elon Musk. And Canada is looking like they're doing something themselves. But the question is, if the EU AI Act is based in these ideas of fundamental EU values, what happens when we impose those values on other countries, or indeed on its member states? How do we define democracy here in Slovakia? How do we define it in the UK? How do we define justice? All these things will come to the fore when countries respond to the Act. So if you're interested, please come and talk to me. We're very interested in people either who specialize in European law, data science, pro-justice work in any space. We think that having the law work means really good civil society, really good labor laws, fantastic policy. We want to see a rise in tech unions that we think are going to be incredibly important in holding companies to account. A rise in ethical whistleblowers that are willing to come out and speak about what their companies are doing if they're being crushed from the inside. I don't know whether you follow the Cambridge Analytica scandal, but that was only made possible because a data scientist spoke to a journalist, Carol Cadwallader, and was able to bring his opinions out into the public forum. So what we're also trying to do is create spaces where really great journalists on AI can talk to engineers. We're trying to improve AI ethics, seminars and things in engineering courses, because we need to get engineers to ask, am I creating an algorithm that does something good? Or am I doing something that could be misused or is having a nasty political effect down the line? So making AI good is often about everything except AI. AI can be a bit of a misnomer. It's about transforming society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Eleanor Drage, University of Cambridge. Eleanor Drage, yes, University of Cambridge. Let me ask you a few questions, please. A rovnako sa prosím, môžete zapojiť aj vy. Stále môžete klasť otázky cez aplikáciu Slido. Môžete na to využiť aj svoj QR kód na vysačke. I was telling the audience, everybody can ask you as well as the other guests. Well, many researchers say artificial intelligence can be a threat. Lately, maybe I'm sure you remember a few months ago, more than 1,000 of researchers even signed a letter, an open letter. So are you sure we shouldn't be scared?
Thank you for this question. So we had a long look at the signatories on this open letter. I don't know whether, everyone know what the open letter was? Okay, well, it was an open letter signed by or created by the Future of Life Institute, and its main signatories were, there were a lot of big tech guys like Elon Musk, and there were a lot of people who were responsible for AI teams and had fired their ethicists. So we as ethicists were concerned that having ignored a lot of ethics teams Google fired Timnit Gebru, fired their main AI ethicists, and then suddenly they were turning around and saying, look, we're really scared about what AI can do, was really annoying for us because we were there at the beginning saying, look, you need to move away from the move fast and break things culture of Silicon Valley. You need to slow down these processes. You need to be really careful about what data you're using for large language models. And so I don't know whether this open letter was it seems very disingenuous, because if they really cared, they would have changed their approach to building AI tools. However, we can't say, of course, that existential risks don't exist. How can you possibly predict a black swan event, something that has never happened before? But if something does happen, if there is an AI apocalypse, it will be because of the monopolization over compute power. It'll be because of a lack of diversity in AI. It'll be because of terrible ethical principles like Google's very, very vague, do no harm, don't create bias. So we need to really join hands between the people who are looking at social issues and the people who are looking at these long-term effects.
We have an interesting question from the audience. Assuming guessing capabilities of persons traits by AI, could we finally prove if there is free will?
There are lots of people looking into free will. I work in a center of philosophers who are very interested in this question of what constitutes free will. I personally come from, so my background looks at not autonomous personhood, so this idea that we're all separate from each other, and we all have this Augustinian free will, which tends to be quite a Christian, comes from this Christian doctrine. But instead, I work with thinkers who explore our relationship to each other. Free will is kind of an illusion that comes from feeling that you have power, agency, choice in your own life. And that, to me, comes from responsible relationships that we have with each other. So I think instead of focusing on this idea of whether we are autonomous or how to make computers autonomous, we need to think about these responsible relationships that we have with each other and with the environment. One of the thinkers that I like the most thinks of consciousness not as a separate thing. So I am conscious, and my consciousness is because I am human, but as the result of all these non-conscious thinking things, like technologies, like the interactions I have with each other, like the cells in my body, that I may not define as conscious, but help me to think. So I think it's more responsible that we think of our interconnectedness, both with the environment and with each other, than our ability to be autonomous.
Another interesting question. Are we close to metrics? AI will identify that in 2046 I'll make a crime and such put me to the jail already today?
So, predictive policing?
Yes. Well, AI will predict that in 2046, let's say, I will make a crime. And then they will put me to the jail already today?
You've been watching too many movies. The problem is not so much that, well, first, AI can't do that, but the problem will be that governments believe that it can, because the belief that it can do that is pretty much the same as it being able to do that. And so our key concern is making sure that governments don't become kind of authoritarian enough to use these kinds of systems. It's about our belief in how they work rather than what they actually do. No engineer will tell you that a system can do that. If computer scientists were ruling the government, they'd be like, no, that's nonsense.
Well, another question, with all this AI acceleration and investment, how far are we from AI singularity?
Oh, the singularity. I once went to so my PhD was in science fiction. I spent a lot of time at science fiction conferences in Helsinki, among other places. And the biggest room of people, I mean, literally, hundreds of people gathered to talk about the singularity. And I thought, what is this thing people are so excited by? we need newness. We crave this idea that we will merge with something and then become other than ourselves. We will be freed from our mortal constraints, from sickness, from a lack of intelligence, and we will become better. But at what cost? We have people like Nick Bostrom, who I don't know whether you know is quite a famous philosopher in the UK, who believes that the singularity will bring about a world where no one has to work, where our cup will overflow, where economies will all be rich and plentiful. There is no evidence to suggest that any technology has been distributed equally. Technologies have made life better for lots of people globally, but never have the effects of technology been good for everyone in the same way. It's very unlikely that AI will either. Now, inequality has reached its greatest point, and so to resolve this, we need to be able to create things that aren't good for everyone, because everyone is the status quo, but technologies that are good for people who have been historically marginalized, who are very much not treated the best, either in the education system or socially. Then we will create something that actively does good for the world. But from what I've seen, the singularity is this kind of fantasy, usually in the West, of something that will transform us, when actually we need to do that hard work ourselves.
Thanks, Eleanor. Next question from the audience. Which tool would you personally describe as the best achievement of AI currently operating in the UK?
I think we're doing amazing work on life sciences. Obviously, we have DeepMind located in London. I'm really excited about the effects for in medical care and healthcare. At Cambridge, we have a lot of startups and spin-outs coming out of university, PhD students who are doing very cool things with machine learning for medicine. I'm also really encouraged by tools that help people in marketing or communications. They're really useful for second language speakers, also for our students that come from abroad, that are able to use these AI tools, particularly ChatGPT-related tools, in order to give themselves a leg up. That obviously brings lots of problems for educators like me, having to sift through a lot of work that's done partly with GPT, but I don't think that's the student's problem. I think that's our problem at this point, and we may need to change the way that we assess people at universities. But it's great that you can send, as a marketeer or as a comms expert, you can send a bunch of stuff out that has been created for you. I think that's just super helpful. It's great for engineers as well. Anyone can become a 10x engineer. ChatGPT is amazing for coding. That's kind of what it was set up for. So there'll be a lot of potential issues down the line, but I'm generally quite excited about those.
People are very interested in asking you, so next question. History shows that legislation falls behind speed of innovation. Is there a new approach to the old problem, or again, are we doing something and hoping for the best?
There's been a lot of behind-the-scenes work that we tend to overlook. AI ethicists have been working on these problems for a long time. I think the public has a sense that we're only just arriving here, that we've only just opened a newspaper and worked out what's going on, whereas ethicists have been working on these problems for quite a while. So it could be worse, I'd like to say, if there wasn't the amount of work that we're doing and have been doing for many years. Yes, regulation is always behind. And this is why self-regulation is really important. I've kind of lost faith in big tech, in Google and Meta. I think they're going to do whatever they want to do. And they're lobbying the EU anyway for amendments to acts. So unfortunately, regulation like the EU AI Act will be differentially experienced by companies that have the money to say, hey, can we not have to do this or that? And then the people that will have to fulfill all their obligations will be medium-sized and small-sized companies. But I think that regulation will, when it comes into enforcement, be really successful.
Thanks. And one last question. You have mentioned the tool for self-assessment of AI systems to conform to AIA. Can you explain how it works? How it will work? These, well, you can see this question there. You have mentioned the tool for self-assessment of AI systems to conform to AIA. Well, if you can explain it.
Yes. Do you mean by the EU AI Act? Yes. So what it's going to be like, so it's an online assessment tool, and this is a kind of one-stop shop for companies that want to that want to be ethical, but also need to fulfill the EU's obligations. And it's like a kind of flow chart, and it takes you through the different things you need to fill in. I think for us, the really important bit was that companies are so bogged down now with all the things they have to think about, that to have many different places where you need to look to fulfill GDPR, to fulfill the EU's obligation, to fulfill local obligations is just too much. And it's a real strain on companies. So we want to make it as easy for companies as possible. You know, I work at Cambridge, not for a company, so it's going to be free. And we're really excited about making good regulation easier to fulfill and injecting it with feminist and anti-racist and pro-justice principles. So it's not merely about box ticking, but about injecting some soul, some life into regulation.
Eleanor, thank you very much for your interesting presentation and also discussion. All the best. Eleanor Drage, University of Cambridge. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.